Hi, this is Pranjal Chandra, and you are listening to Budget on Political Reform.
When we talk about governments and power, what do you picture? Maybe an image of a corrupt and all too familiar politician has come up in your mind. And if you've wandered far enough, you might have even thought about their connections. Maybe a president with huge media shares, or an heir who's inherited generations of influence. These people share the undeniable lure of mixing business with politics. Whether you believe in getting rid of the bad apples in a sound system, or think this is expected behavior, studying ways to break these ties can make real differences in people's lives. Turkey is an interesting case study for this, because political parties have had a cozy relationship with the private sector for a long time. In fact, this can be dated back to the end of the Ottoman Empire, when the government first took hold of state-controlled industrial development and designed economic policies that made it more appealing to work in the private sector than in civil service. While the question of who's in power has changed, the political dependence of the business class has remained the same. The current ruling party, the AKP, has been a major player for the last 30 years and is headed by Recep Tayyip Erdoğan. Now there are a few things to know about him. Erdoğan rose to power as prime minister in 2003 with a strong Islamist message at a time when Turkish politics was overwhelmingly secular. He wasn't able to seek a new term in 2014 because he had already served 3 terms, which was the party's limit. Instead, he ran for president, which previously had been a much more ceremonial role. However, since winning the election, Erdoğan has become known for his increasingly authoritarian behavior. In 2016, he famously repressed a violent coup attempt, and this authoritarian behavior has grown even stronger since. To get another perspective on the Turkish political environment, we interviewed a recent college graduate from Turkey, Deniz Tokmagul, who's a student at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy, to understand how he sees the problem and what it's been like to grow up in Erdoğan's Turkey.
So they did increase a lot of freedoms. They championed for media freedoms as well. But starting from 2007, we start to see a backlash in that. The party is starting to employ more authoritarian tendencies and laws, which ended up in Gezi protests, which is like the biggest series of protests in the modern Turkish history against the party and against Erdoğan.
In this episode, we dig deeper into Erdoğan's increasingly authoritarian rule by considering his connections to Turkey's private sector. How have state-business relationships evolved in Turkey, and what are the impacts of these relationships on Turkish society? To find out, we speak to Professor Emine Deniz, a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Chicago and a regional expert in Turkey's political economy. Emine Deniz has recently taken a new angle in exploring these relationships by using the stock market as an indicator of the effects of conflict on political leadership. Pranjal Chandra, a master's student in public policy at the Harris School, got a chance to speak with Professor Deniz about what she's found.
Professor, before we start, let's zoom out and start with the bigger question of when we say connection between business class and political class, what does this mean? What does a connection really signify over here?
So there are 2 ways that people can look at how the connection between business class and political class can affect the overall political economy of the country. The first one is the one that you are going to hear or read a lot when you are reading The Economist, New York Times, Washington Post. It is what we call the neoliberal economy, where the state is trying to make it as easy as possible for the businesses to operate in the system. And from US and UK, it caught up in every single part of the world. Now there are not many countries that we can say who are not neoliberals. Of course, the most important example is North Korea.
Emine explains that in this neoliberal system, we can end up seeing things like less regulation and tax breaks for businesses with political connections, but in the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen this kind of behavior go even further in some countries, and we're seeing what academics call a neo-patrimonial system. This is a system of government where public institutions, frameworks, and laws exist in name, but in practice, it's really the ruler and their personal connections who hold all the power and determine who can succeed. Emine compares it to the wild, wild west. Aside from getting close with the rulers, there aren't really a lot of rules that govern these states, and the officials in charge are looking to personally profit in order for you to get ahead.
In Turkey, we have seen it as the finance minister being the son-in-law of the president, and the finance minister's brother is running the media conglomerate in Turkey, which means that when you are hearing about news on the economy of Turkey, it is going through a filter which has been governed by the finance minister's brother.
To put things in perspective, Professor Deniz compares China and Russia.
China letting its export and import competing firms with credits from the Chinese bank, which is not their central bank, but the bank which is owned by the Chinese Communist Party, at an incredibly low interest rate, which means that they're just helping them out, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Chinese Communist Party and its leaders are having a kickback. This is one sort of state-business relationship. In the neo-patrimonial state-business relationship, in fact, the state is letting the business to flourish, and they can overnight just make the business go away.
There does seem to be a pattern. Khodorkovsky was once Russia's richest man by buying cut-rate state oil assets in questionable auctions after the Soviet Union collapsed. But in a frank moment, he publicly crossed Putin on the rampant corruption under his rule. Overnight, he went from oligarch to accused of tax evasion and fraud. He spent 10 years in a Siberian prison camp until he was pardoned in 2013.
So, in a neo-patrimonial system, we have a life cycle for businesses that's defined around the country's leader. Businesses can succeed if they maintain a personal relationship with the leader where both benefit, but at the same time, they know that if the leader dies or is overthrown, then they've lost everything that made them successful. When there's a transition of power, we'll see a new set of companies who are close to the new leader start to dominate in the market. So, for businesses operating within these systems, their political connections can be extremely important.
Now, coming to Turkey, we have seen how neoliberalism evolved policies in the last century. For Turkey, this is how Professor Deniz described the situation.
I don't think there is a name in our current political economy context for the early Turkish Republic, because that was a country that has been built up from scratch. They had some kind of industrialists, but they were either run away from country or they were killed right before the collapse of Ottoman Empire.
Professor Deniz traces the Turkish Republic's foundation to after the Armenian genocide. There's a lot of complicated history over there, but what you need to know is how she sees neoliberalism and neo-patriotism play out together, is when the government had to decide where to distribute land to new members of their countries.
So at that point, it was something between neoliberal and neo-patrimonial, where the state decides who gets to be the industrialist and exactly in which area that they are going to operate it. And then between 1923 to 1945, Turkey was ruled by a single party, and that single party was in fact a state business. We have state plans for economy, state was building up industries, state was giving land free for some industrial parts. So that part was neither neoliberal nor neo-patrimonial. It was textbook state.
In 1945, the center-right party, called the Democrat Party, took over by gaining a lot of agrarian votes. Basically what happened after was that the party gave the agrarians a lot of incentives to industrialize in the heart of Anatolia. This is the first instance we see of neoliberalism coming out in Turkey to help industries grow. And by the 1980s, most of the Republican-era regulations were gone. But here's a caveat and a key difference from the ruling AKP.
Turkey also has a history of military owning lots of industrial holdings. So we were not necessarily neoliberal. Justice and Development Party, or AKP in Turkish abbreviation, started definitely as neoliberal because they didn't have their own business class.
So the AKP are coming from this tradition, which is decidedly Islamic in their political alignment. So people were afraid, and AKP had to show them that they were as neoliberal as it gets. Thus the regulation were relaxed, but Erdogan's family did not have any direct connections with these industries that have grown over the past generations, the same firms that can keep him in power. Emine sees him cement his power after he is elected president in 2014 and takes us to Turkey's current neo-patrimonial state.
But I think the time that we see it for sure was 2013 after the Gezi protests.
Instead of dispersing the protesters, the violent crackdowns resulted in the social uprising growing in strength and numbers, as discontent with Prime Minister Erdogan's autocratic style and Islamic agenda hit boiling point.
Because that was the time when Erdogan realized that if he does not have the media, which is the biggest industry in Turkey or in any part of the world, it would be really hard for him to crash any kind of protest against them. Which means that in my paper, when I look at the companies and I coded them as connected to the incumbent, I need to do it in degrees. Because there are some firms which are in fact connected to any party who is going to rule. So today it's AKP or Justice and Development Party. Tomorrow it can be one of the opposition parties and they are going to align themselves to them.
Just to pivot the topic a little bit, I asked Emine about what do these political relationships really mean for a democracy?
Of course, as you might imagine, in democracies or in any kind of liberal democracy, the first thing that we are looking at is whether or not property rights are secure. And in that case, it's not. Because if you have a problem with Erdogan, he can send the tax authority after you. That's what he has done to Aydın Doğan.
The ad promotes one of Turkey's largest selling newspapers, Posta, owned by the country's largest media group, now facing the largest tax fine in Turkish history, $2.5 billion US.
Everybody is shocked with the news.
In fact, I was talking within the context of state-business relationships. Of course, there are many important aspects of democracies, but by property rights, what we in the political economy jargon was talking about is, imagine that you are building a factory, which means that you are investing and you are hiring people, you are putting your saved money there, and you need to make sure that there is no scenario in the world that the state will one day come and confiscate your property.
That is the ideal situation. What we've seen play out is that in some countries, the government's mediator role doesn't really work because they become intricately connected to the people who put them in power. So you lose the trust of potential investors that should otherwise benefit from liberal policies. So far, we've talked about how connections erode public trust. In Turkey's case, Erdogan sent a message that he can easily take away your rights to own a business, even under a democratic system. We'll talk more about this when we ask Emine about her research. For now, here's the million-dollar question.
Why does it even matter if business class and political class are connected as long as the economy is growing?
What you are asking right now and what we are thinking right now is, of course, there is nothing when you look at the hard data of GDP growth, human development, most of the time increase in education, increasing GDP per capita. But then the problem becomes, how are we going to keep the politicians accountable? Imagine that this politician is helping a fuel industry to move forward. Fuel industry employs a lot of people. If it's employment, they employ a lot of people. We can say that, yes, there might be environmental regulations and there might be a fuel industry. But then, imagine film industry becomes so powerful that they don't even need the state anymore, and they are so rich that